Can everybody hear me okay? You've got I think a little chat box down in the bottom of the screen there. If there are any problems or you can't hear me, or you want to ask a question, or anything isn't clear and you'd like me to clarify, then just jot it down in that chat box there, and I'll do my best to rectify the situation or answer your question. So yeah, hello everybody. I think we've got 4 people in the room at the moment. Maybe some other people will who have signed up will log on in a minute, but we'll get going. Fabio, hi. I think you were in the last one that we did of these a few months back. So good to see you again. So this is about how to get press attention for your faculty. It's one of the kind of key things if you're a PR or communications person from an international business school. It's one of the things that our clients are always looking for us to help them with. But I think it's something that is difficult and certainly takes a bit of work. So I've just put together a bit of a presentation on how I think it's best to go about this. So faculty are a business school's best resource, in my opinion, to gain attention on the international stage. They have research, which kind of lends itself well to the media. They have practical knowledge from industry experience. Often they've worked with companies. They have worked inside companies. They've had careers before being academics, perhaps. They're very up to date on key business issues, which makes them very, very good for commenting on things that are going on in the press, in the media world, in the business world. And they know what's going on in the classroom as well, which I find they're very, very good voices for answering questions for people who care about what's going on in the world of business schools. The likes of the FT and the Wall Street Journal, the people that write about these sorts of things. They're the people that engage with students and know what's going on. And quite often they learn from students as well, because a lot of their students are executives in companies, if they're doing stuff at the executive education level, executive MBA level. And also, they learn things through doing exercises with these guys and teaching them. So, as much as we'd like the press to pay attention to, the fact that we've opened a new campus in some far-flung corner of the earth, or that you've launched a new program or a new part of your MBA program, those things are only interesting up to a point. So really, it's where the faculty come in, that they really do provide an opportunity to get your school into the press, into the media, in a way that's otherwise difficult to do so. It's a really crowded marketplace. There are loads of business schools all over the world of varying qualities, and there's numerous faculty at each of those schools that you're competing with, who want to have their voice heard, who want to be in the media. I mean, some more than others, but nevertheless, there's a lot of voices out there, a lot of opportunities for journalists to speak with and get content from business school faculty. So it's difficult to kind of get in there and to have your member of faculty or your professor heard. So what can you do? This might seem a bit obvious, but really, there are 2 routes into the media. I'm not going to cover off every possible thing that you could do to achieve media coverage for your faculty, but the 2 key things really that we come back to time and time again are press releases and pitching directly to journalists. If you search online for a phrase, "Is the press release dead?" you'll see loads of responses come back. Just a few here on the screen now, where you can see that people are constantly writing about PR and about press releases and saying that they're outmoded, they're out of date. There are better ways to engage with journalists these days. People talk a lot about content and content, creating your own content, and also about video and social media and all that sort of stuff. But And it's a valid argument, it is certainly a discussion to have, because I think a lot of press releases are redundant. A lot of them are done very badly. They don't, get any real impact. So I do see why people are talking about this, but we have. Oh, sorry, this is just another slide. This is just to further illustrate the point, actually. Um, Alex Aiken, who was a British government communications chief a few years back, um, said that the cozy process of writing a press release and sending it out to journalists was just telesales. And he argued that press officers should be content producers. He says you shouldn't start with 3 pages of A4. That point I will agree with. It should never be as long as pages of A4, but with a tweet, an infographic, or a video. And I kind of disagree with him, if I'm honest. We have success with press releases, and specifically with press releases that get your faculty's points of view and their opinions and their knowledge out there. Examples. Here's something that we did relatively recently. Now, this was from a piece of research from one of our clients, and the headline of the research wasn't "Handsome Men More Likely to Be Rejected from Competitive Jobs," but we turned it into a release. It was, it was a full-on piece of academic research, but we turned it into a piece focused in on that particular aspect. And I think, this was particularly successful. It went out and hit over 300 publications globally, some of which I've just attempted to list there in a rather long line of international publications. But I think you get the point. That kind of went viral. Another one here, motherhood penalty in worst pay at work, about women in the workplace and the issue that keeps coming up time and time again about equality, which is a popular issue, a popular story. And again, you see here, this is coverage on the BBC News website, which really, again, helps. If you can get a hit on the BBC News website, it really helps with the virality and the spread that you can get from the coverage. It really tends to go global at that point, which was illustrated by the fact that this was taken up by a load of publications all around the world. So I'm just going to loosen my tie slightly here because feeling as I'm choking myself. So those were 2 releases that we did that were hugely successful. What did they have in common? I mean, the releases that we did, the first one ran to 295 words and the other one was 380 words. If you remember the quote that I just said from the government communications officer, he said it should never run to 3 pages of A4, and I said I agreed with him. 295 words and 380 words, I think, is about 2/3 of a page of A4, roughly. It's short, it's punchy, it's not too, it's just not long. You have to point across quickly. They both had short and descriptive headlines, and I think that's one of the things that people really struggle with when writing a press release, is getting a headline that tells the story but does so in as few words possible. Mothers paid 3% less at work per child, and handsome men rejected from competitive jobs. Now, it might seem as though they were quite obvious and quite easy to come up with, but as I said, they were derived from pieces of academic research that were in no way worded that simply. So it's about talking to the professor, really digging down into the research, reading the research properly, and then thinking about how you can translate that academic language into something that's translatable and understandable and speaks to an issue in the business world. Both of the releases in those instances had the main takeaway, the main point of the research, and the main point that we wanted to illustrate in the research in the first sentence. So those are the examples. Handsome men may be rejected from competitive jobs that are preferred for roles that require cooperation, according to research. So that, again, sums up just the gist of what's, it gives the journalist, and this is the key point, it gives the journalist a very, very good idea of what they're going to get if they continue to read this release. And that's always the challenge. They are very, very short on time. They get, I think I spoke, you can there are loads of different figures attributable to this, but I spoke to a journalist relatively recently who told me that she got over 400 press releases per week, and she certainly doesn't read 400 press releases per week. Most of them go straight into the delete pile or into the bin or whatever it is on your email. Um, so you have to give them something that they think, right, straight away, the title is relevant, read the first paragraph. Am I going to get something interesting out of this? Is it worth me digging further? And both of these press releases obviously achieved that. But it's a difficult thing. Much like the headline, you've got to try and get as much information and as much clarity as possible in as few words. And they both only had one quote. This is one thing that I see from press releases again and again and again that are written that find their way into me, is that they often have 4 or 5 quotes from everybody that was involved, either in the piece of research or in the announcement that's being made. And that A, makes them too long, and B, most of the time, the quotes don't actually say anything other than, we're really delighted that this has happened, and I'd like to thank such and such, and so and so. And it's just platitudes and vague kind of quotes, really, that don't actually tell you anything. I see the quote as a real opportunity within a press release. If you think about how a press release should be structured, you get that first um, kind of key point in there in the first paragraph, and then you might talk a little bit about how that research was conducted and a little bit about, you know, some other key findings, perhaps keeping it nice and short, but just giving the journalists the key information that they need and keeping it quite factual. But then the quote gives you an opportunity to really inject some personality, and in this instance, the professor's personality and opinions into what is otherwise a factual statement. So that's what the quote does. And if you have one quote from one key person that really injects a bit of personality, a bit of an opinion, adds a bit of context to the whole story, then that gives the journalist an idea of, hey, maybe this person is somebody that I want to speak to. And that has to be one of the key goals when you have a journalist reading a press release, is, you know, ultimately you want that journalist to get in touch with the professor and say, hey, can you tell me some more about this? I'm really interested in writing an article. The other side of the coin is, if you write a good press release and it's got a lot of good stuff in there, then, you know, it can be turned into content and it can just be put straight up, or the journalist can write something without having to speak to anybody, and that's desirable as well. So if you kind of follow these rules, then I think you stand a good chance of achieving one or both of those goals with your release. So yeah, just to sum up, give it a snappy title, open with a key finding, keep it short and to the point, and limit quotes, and make those quotes personable. Make it sound as though that's actually a person talking, as though it actually is a quote, rather than just something that's been put in quotation marks by the PR manager, or, you know, their assistant or whoever. And most importantly, you know, choose what you want to press release carefully and target it appropriately, because there's nothing worse than for a journalist than getting a bunch of press releases that are absolutely of no relevance or import to what they do. At this point, there's one press release that I worked on recently, and it was for a professor called Laura Guillen at a German business school. And it was on women in the workplace, you know, that old chestnut that comes up again and again and again. But it was a really good piece of research, and it got a lot of traction. Not as much as the previous ones that I'm talking about, but, you know, in specialist HR press, it got some really good results. The title of her working paper, and the paper that was published as an academic piece, was "Appearing Self-Confident and Getting Credit for It: Why It May Be Easier for Men Than Women to Gain Influence at Work." Now, that's by no means the worst or most wordy or most impenetrable title for a piece of academic research that I've ever seen. In fact, it's quite good and quite brief, really. But at the same time, it's too long for a press release, and it's probably a bit vague. It doesn't really tell the story of exactly what you're going to get. At this point, I was going to try and pull out of the presentation and show you that particular release and what was achieved through it. But it seems that I can't do that in this program. But I'm just going to have a quick remind myself. So the Yeah. So the title that we ended up going with was "Women must be both confident and caring to succeed in the workplace." And so that took quite a bit of, oops, sorry, digging to get to, because again, it was quite a big piece of academic research that touched on numerous points about women in the workplace and how they could use self-confidence to get ahead. But the one thing that really jumped out to me was Laura was using this word pro-social, which I didn't really know what it meant. So I asked her, and she said, well, it means that women, or anybody really, when they're being pro-social, they're caring for other people. That's the crux of it. And when she said that, I thought, well, there's your headline. So not only do women have to be confident in the workplace, they have to care for others, whereas men don't have to. And that became the headline of the release. And as a result, it did very well. So that in that instance, it was about digging through the research, finding something that you thought was interesting and that you could really hang a hook on and get a headline out of, and almost ignoring the rest of the research and just focusing in on one thing. Sometimes it takes a bit of work to convince a professor because they feel as though you're ignoring a lot of the stuff that they've done, but really in order to get the attention that their work deserves and they feel it deserves, you sometimes have to cut out a load of the stuff and focus in on the one thing that you know will grab attention. So that's press releases. That's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. And I do think that press releases offer, if done correctly, a very, very strong route into getting attention for your faculty internationally. The other thing is, and I think pitching is enormously complicated. I think with a press release, it takes a bit of technique, a bit of nous. There are some steps you can take. But pitching really, when I sat down to think about it, it relies on knowledge, pitching, in various aspects. Way, I don't think, to pitch successfully. A successful pitch almost always relies on your knowledge of what you are pitching, who you are pitching to, and the wider media and current affairs landscape. And it's a bit of work to kind of get to that point. It takes time. Fundamentals of engaging with a journalist when you're pitching are still important. Keep it brief, keep it snappy, the stuff that we talked about for press releases, whilst including all of the necessary info. Provisos. The better you know the journalist and the more directly relevant the pitch is, if you know that this pitch is something that they really want to hear about and something that they write about, then the more detailed you can be. But you have to know those things. You have to, because if you put a massive detailed pitch together and spend loads of time writing something that is detailed and gives all of the information, and it does take time to do that. If you're not sure that the journalist is going to be interested, then you possibly and probably wasting your time. But again, it's all based on knowledge of the market, knowledge of who you're pitching to, and that's something that takes time to develop. As a PR person, you have to build that kind of knowledge up through reading relevant publications, through talking to people, and really getting to know your market. And I think reading relevant publications is probably the most important point there. I don't think there really are any shortcuts to successful pitching. I think a lot of people probably spend a lot of time pitching and it's wasted. And it is, I think, a less than guaranteed way of getting attention. I mean, you might know one or two people with a particular piece of research or with a particular professor in mind who you think, yes, they're very interested. But again, they get lots and lots of pitches. They have lots of emails to sort through. So when you only, with a press release, you're sending it out to 50, 100, 10, 25, a number of people, no matter what you're doing. Whereas with the pitch, it should be focused in very much on one or two people and then seeing where you can go with it. But for that reason, it means that you can go nowhere fast. And I do think it relies a lot on luck and timing as well, because you can never know. I mean, journalists and editors always have their own agendas. They have their own editorial agendas. They know what they're going to be writing 6 months down the line, 3 months down the line, next week. But you don't. And occasionally, you do your homework and you have an idea. You talk to people. You have an idea about what people are going to be writing and what they might be interested in next week. But quite often, I think we find ourselves behind the curve and trying to pitch in relation to a story that's already broken. So sometimes it is a case of just getting something out there to the right person and hoping that it's something that they're going to be interested in. So having said all of that and not really given an enormous amount of guidance on what makes a successful pitch, apart from it being short and as short as possible, as punchy as possible, as enticing as possible, just like a press release should be, it's really just about knowing the market. And I'd say I'm 100% more effective at pitching now than I was when I started doing this 7 or 8 years ago, because I know more people, I know what they're interested in, I know about more publications. It's not so much that I'm better at pitching per se, it's just I've got more information to work with. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of PR people within schools struggle with is they just don't have the time. They're harassed. They have lots of people knocking on their doors. They have other responsibilities. Quite often, the marketing person is the PR person, is the communications person. They have meetings, and they just don't have time to build up that kind of depth of knowledge in multiple markets around the world. They might be able to do it in their home market, but it's difficult to build up that depth of knowledge across enough markets to have a truly global and international feel for where you should pitch and who you should pitch to with your professors. And I suppose that's what we do every day, and what Blue Sky works towards doing is knowing who's out there and who's worth pitching to for various things. But having said all of that, and it's hard work pitching, and it can be a bit of a slog, and you can feel as though you're getting nowhere very fast. There is a potential for it for a big payoff. A good, timely, well-placed pitch can result in really, really good coverage that you perhaps are unlikely to get from a press release. So, just some examples. This is something for The Economist. I set up, this is, I think, last summer. I pitched a professor who worked at one of our client schools, ESCP Europe, and he was head of their energy team, their energy department that ran a specialized master's in energy management. And he met with a journalist, he had a phone call with the journalist actually about what he was doing in the energy space. And he happened to mention that a number of their students were actually taking a road trip in electric cars around Europe to promote the idea of electric vehicle usage and to prove that you could go on a long journey in an electric car and it wouldn't just die, basically. So it was all part of their energy master's program. And that led to this piece in The Economist, which was where actually a student wrote a diary, and that was suggested by the professor. And that, that's something that you're probably unlikely to get from a press release, I'd say. This is another example. This is apologize for the slightly blurry photo there that's on the presentation, but this is a piece of coverage from the Financial Times, and this was based on research we did do a press release for, but we pitched it first before we sent a press release out to the one person at the Financial Times that we thought would take a real interest in this, a guy called Andrew Hill. And he took it on and he interviewed the professor, and it resulted in this piece of coverage, which was, I think, on page 3 or 4 of the paper. It was also online, but it also, so that's a good result already, direct from a pitch to a person that we pretty much knew would be interested in the issue. So made it onto the front page of the paper. On the far left there, you can see, again, it's a little bit blurry because it's a scan of a hard copy, but that's the FT briefing, where they basically put the 5 or 6 biggest stories in the paper that day on the front page. So it made it into that. It's right down at the bottom. I don't know if you can see that. It says UK geeks paid more, but results, can't read it, but you can see it at the bottom there. And also it made it into the Lombard column, which has been cut off slightly there. But that's that's written by somebody else entirely. So he'd spoken internally about this research just to the person that wrote the Lombard column, and it made it in there as well. So again, from that one pitch, which took maybe 10, 15 minutes just to put together and pitch to the right person, we got a really, really great result for that professor, who was absolutely over the moon with getting in the, on the front page of the Financial Times, to have an in-depth article further into the paper and to be mentioned in one of the premier columns from one of their columnists. Very, very happy with that. And this is another example. This is just, you can just see the headline there and the rather strange picture that the FT chose to use for it. But this was a pitch where it was pitched to the business education team at the Financial Times, and it actually featured several of our French clients, because we had 3 or 4 clients at the time in France, who were opening new campuses in various other places of the world, and it just seemed like a bit of a trend. So we pulled it all together into one pitch and sent it off to the guy at the business education desk, and he interviewed all of the people and wrote an article that actually ended up in the business school rankings issue and online for the Financial Times as well. So that was just an instance of kind of again, knowing your audience, knowing that a journalist that's going to be, you know, if you want to pitch a larger article, they're likely to be looking for some kind of trend. So rather than just pitching one school that was, you know, opening a campus internationally, pitching 3 or 4 and saying, hey, you know, this probably warrants an article because there's 3 or 4 that are all doing it at the same time, and you know, what's the reasoning? Do you want to find out? And he did. And then just to speak to the international piece, I know that I've been talking a lot recently about, you know, kind of The Economist and the Financial Times, which are international publications but based out of the UK. I often find that pitching, as opposed to writing a press release, can be a quicker and easier way into the more international media out there. So, for instance, there's an article here on the left-hand side of the page as you look at it in the Career Herald. That's a professor writing a column on why you'd want to take an online MBA. There's some stuff there from the Middle East where a professor was talking about a knowledge lab event that he was running in Qatar. There's something there from South America. There's something there from China Daily. And there's something there from the Times of India, and all these pieces here have come from pitches to those journalists at those publications, and I do find that we get a higher hit rate for, if you know who to go to, that's the key, at these publications than you perhaps would if you're pitching to the likes of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or Forbes or Business Week. To summarize, a very simple slide to kind of sum up here. It really isn't easy to get your professors out there, again, for the reasons we mentioned at the top of the presentation. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of people trying to get heard. But in my experience and in our experience, if you focus in on press releases and in targeted pitching and follow the kind of, certainly with the press release, follow the formula that you know, keeping it short and snappy, you know, one quote, and then with pitching, really just trying to build up that base of knowledge, and it will get easier with time. Then I think it can get a little bit easier than it might be. How long have I been talking for now? About half an hour, I think. So I wanted to keep it within half an hour so you didn't all nod off. But if anybody has any questions or anything that they want to add, or any experiences that they've had in doing this kind of thing, or anything that I haven't mentioned, then note it down in the chat box and I'll try to answer. Otherwise, if there aren't any questions, we'll leave it there, and I will thank you very much for your time. Thanks very much. Cheers.